Hi guys, I am here with True Stories. This one is one that's got several different stories together under the same category. And the quote before it is by Sir Thomas Browne. "We carry within us the wonders we seek without us." And these stories are called Heavenly Sights. In today's climate of signs and wonders, visions are especially interesting. Two types that occurred in biblical days are frequently reported now as well. One is an inner vision, a sense or event perceived with the eyes or the spirit, rather than with physical eyes. The other is an actual apparition, when the supernatural temporarily intrudes into everyday life for reasons perhaps only God knows. Diane Alford of Tallahassee, Florida, experienced a vision while praying one Sunday in church. "Without any warning, an image of my son Jeremy flashed before my eyes," she says. "He was in his car racing down a long 2-lane Georgia road. Other cars appeared in this scene, and I was overcome with fear." Diane began to pray intensely. "God, protect my son. God, protect my son." She was certain Jeremy was in extreme danger. Suddenly, Diane felt as if she were flying through the air. Now she was hovering over Jeremy's car, now passing through the roof. She saw her son behind the wheel as feathered wings wrapped him in a soft embrace. Diane looked to the right where Jeremy's girlfriend sat. She watched as one of the wings reached over to embrace the girl as well. "It was almost as if I was inside the angel, looking at the scene through her eyes," she says. Then Diane heard the squeal of tires, the crash of metal, screams. Slowly the scene receded, and she realized she was still in church, still pleading, praying on her knees while everyone else was standing up. How could she have lost contact with her surroundings? Felt as if she had actually been transported through space. Diane stood up, shaky and confused. Later, at home, she was still puzzling over the episode. Should she try to reach Jeremy? Suddenly the phone rang. It was her older son, Jason. "Mom," he said, "don't get excited. Everything's okay, but Jeremy and his girlfriend were in a bad car wreck this morning." It was on a busy 2-lane highway in Georgia. Diane gripped the telephone. "What time did it happen?" she asked. But she already knew. The accident had occurred at the very moment she received the vision of her son. Her prayers had somehow summoned the angel who protected him and his passenger. And here's another one. Dr. Candace Williamson Murdoch of Rome, Georgia, had just had a miscarriage. The night after she returned from the hospital, she stayed awake, restless and upset. This baby had not been her first, but like all children, it was irreplaceable, and she grieved deeply at its loss. Suddenly a scene appeared as if it was on a movie screen right in front of me, Candace recounts. She blinked, but the vision remained. It was a sunny green meadow. In its midst were dogs playing and chasing each other. Moving toward the right side, the dogs seemed somehow familiar, she says. "I suddenly realized that they were our family pets' dogs from my childhood." Watching intently, Candace then saw her father running into the center of the scene of the dogs, leaping joyfully about him. Her father had been killed in a plane crash 7 years ago. He had raised and always loved dogs. Then Candace realized that her father was not alone. He was gripping the hand of a small blonde child. They were looking toward the right. Candace's father seemed to be pointing at something, as if he were explaining it, and both were smiling. Instantly, Candace knew this child was the baby she'd just lost. Obviously, her father was welcoming the child into heaven, and God had allowed her to witness it, so she would be consoled. I cannot explain how much comfort this vision gave me, Candace says. I have never experienced anything like it, nor would I have pictured heaven in this way. But I was not hallucinating. To know that my child, my father, and his beloved dogs were all together was the best answer to prayer that I could have asked for. God does care. Yes, he does. Yes, he does. And that was a doctor. A lot of them don't believe, So it's good when they experience things for themselves, because when you hear it from another person, a lot of times people still don't believe. A lot of people will not believe unless they see something for themselves. That's why I keep quiet about a lot of things, because nobody believes it anyway. They just think you're crazy. The Right Reverend Robert R. Shahan, Bishop of the Episcopal Church of Arizona, recalls when he and others were interviewing priests for a church position. Each applicant was asked to describe the most profound spiritual experience he had ever had. One story, says Bishop Shahan, was especially hard to forget. The church was filled that Sunday morning, and the priest had just ascended the pulpit to begin his sermon. Casually, he looked up at the beautiful vaulted ceiling, and his heart seemed to stop. Far above the congregation, in a corner over the choir loft, floated two huge angels clothed in white. Father gasped, then recovered smoothly. Years of training before an audience had served him well, but was something actually there? Unobstructedly, he looked up again. Yes, magnificent creatures, glorious and glowing, one with his hands raised in an attitude of blessing over the congregation. But it couldn't be. Why would angels grace his church? He was just an ordinary person. Quickly, Father brought his gaze back to his prepared text. He must be hallucinating, he thought, for the congregation was as quiet and attentive as ever. Surely if something was actually up there, someone else would see it too, and apparently no one had. He needed a vacation, that was it. He would get through this service as quickly as possible, then phone his bishop to ask for time off to rest and recover. He hurried to his homely's close, then returned to the altar. The next time he peeked at the ceiling, the figures had disappeared. The service seemed interminable, but as it ended, Father's heart rate had almost returned to normal, and he walked calmly to the back of the church to greet the congregation. His flock filed past, unusually talkative and vibrant. What a lovely service, Father. Church seemed especially interesting today. The comments were warm, encouraging. If only they knew. These dear people who put so much faith in his leadership. The end of the line was in sight, and finally, one elderly lady was left. She stepped up and took his hand. You seemed a bit distracted today, Father. At the beginning of your homily, she said. Well, yes, he smiled, but it was nothing really. Oh, but I think it was. The woman bent toward him. The air around them seemed charged with electricity, as if they were alone in a circle of love. Then she beamed and lowered her voice. You saw them too, didn't you? She said. So he wasn't the only one that seen them. The next story. Joan Clayton of New Mexico was concerned about the girl her son Lane was going to marry. The young couple seemed to argue constantly. A little incompatibility was normal in a relationship, Joan mused, as she and her husband drove home from a weekend at Lane's college campus. But her son and future daughter-in-law disagreed on everything, and always had, right from the beginning of their relationship. Now Joan leaned back and closed her eyes. Lord, she prayed silently, if this is not the right girl for Lane, please send the right one into his life. Immediately, Joan experienced a vivid inner vision of two girls. although the one on the left was only a darkened silhouette. Joan recognized her as Lane's fiancée. The smiling girl on the right, however, Joan had never seen before. She was a beautiful, blue-eyed blonde, dazzling and vivacious in living color. The scene lasted briefly, but long enough for Joan to know it had not been just her imagination. There is something that happens in your spirit, perhaps an awareness of God's timing. It's hard to explain, but you know that this is not an ordinary experience, Joan says. During the following months, Joan occasionally thought of the visions and wondered what it meant. Surely she shouldn't take it seriously, especially since her son's wedding plans were in full swing. 2 weeks before the big event, however, Lane's fiancé called off the wedding. Lane was devastated. 2 years later, the Claytons went to Lane's campus to attend his college graduation. When we arrived at his apartment, he asked us to wait while he went to pick up a friend, Joan says. When Lane returned with his friend Carrie, Joan gasped. It was the blue-eyed blonde girl she had seen in her vision 2 years earlier. Today, Carrie is Joan's daughter-in-law and the mother of her grandchildren. She is the most wonderful girl in the whole world, says Joan, and everyone who knows her agrees that she came straight from the Lord. Next story. Valerie Neal had been brought up in a lovely home by parents who worked hard to support their large family. But she married Wayne Wood against her parents' wishes. They did not feel Wayne could provide well for Valerie. And though she and Wayne had a wonderful relationship, her parents became somewhat estranged from them. Occasionally, they would show up at unexpected moments to check on their daughter's well-being. Then they would retreat into quiet disapproval. Now Valerie and Wayne had hit difficult financial times, and they were being evicted. Our second baby was only 2 months old, and I probably could have gone to my parents and asked for help, Valerie recalls, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, because I knew they would think our marriage was a failure. I had the same situation in my family. None of them's ever accepted my husband, and his family's never wanted anything to do with me. Never wanted him to be with me. Instead, she and Wayne borrowed $100 to put their future in furniture in storage, and slept in their car at a truck stop. Sherman and I were homeless too. Nobody would let us even spend the night, and it was winter. Praying all the while that Wayne would find a job. On the third day, Wayne applied for emergency aid, and that evening he received enough to pay for a room at the Mirren Motel. Valerie was relieved that her family would sleep in beds that night, but she still worried about not keeping in touch with her folks. At midnight, she finally turned off the light. God, she murmured into the darkness, I need some help. I don't know how you'll do it, but could you please let Mom and Dad know that I'm okay? Early the following morning, Valerie and Wayne took the babies and went out to get some coffee. We didn't have enough money for breakfast, Valerie recalls. When they returned, there was a note on their motel room door. Call me, Mother, it said. Valerie started to tremble. It was definitely her mother's handwriting. But how had Mrs. Neal known where to find them, and particularly their specific room number, 25? When Valerie phoned, however, she realized how tenderly God had answered her prayer of the previous night. Mrs. Neal explained that she had paid an unexpected visit to Valerie's apartment earlier that week, only to learn from neighbors that the Woods had been evicted. For the next few days, she had waited for a phone call from her daughter, but when Valerie hadn't contacted her, Mrs. Neal had become increasingly concerned. Where could the young family be? Were they safe? Did they have food, shelter? By the third evening, her worry was overwhelming her, and she had to take a risk. Mark, she told Valerie's younger brother, please drive around town and see if you can find Valerie and Wayne's car. Mark had been gone several hours, and Mrs. Nill was in bed when she heard that the front door open. She looked at the clock, 1 a.m. Had he found his sister? All the lights came on through the house, and Mark came in and stood at the foot of her bed. There seemed to be another man standing at the bedroom door, although she could not see him clearly. Perhaps a friend of Mark? Valerie is in room 25 at the Mirren Motel, Mark announced. He did not mention his companion or provide any additional details. It didn't matter. Her daughter was safe, if only temporarily. Thanks, Mark, Valerie's mother said, relieved. You go on to bed. Tomorrow she would decide what to do. Mrs. Nill fell asleep quickly, however. She awakened when the front door slammed. Her bedside clock said 4 a.m. Who? Again the lights came on throughout the house, and Mark strode into her room. I found Valerie, he said. I don't know what room she's staying in, but her car is parked at the Mirren Motel. Puzzled, Mrs. Nill sat up. Mark, why did you wake me? You and your friend told me hours ago that Valerie is in room 25 at the Mirren. No, I didn't, Mark protested. I've been looking for her all night. I just got here. And I've been alone the whole time. The Nills eventually grew to love their son-in-law, and Valerie and Wayne have a wonderful and fulfilling life today in Springs, Georgia. But the family still marvels over Mrs. Nill's vision, who visited her that night, just an hour after her daughter's prayer, with the specific information she needed. Who was standing in the shadows watching the scene? No one knows for sure, but Valerie learned a valuable lesson. During those hard times, I thought God had forgotten me, she says, but he knew where I was all along. He always does, guys. Always, no matter where you go. He is always, always with you. Never forget that.